Let's get started. Friends, we're so excited to end the day with this conversation. I think this is in so many ways a very pragmatic way to ground what has been an incredibly enriching day. For those of you in the crowd, how many people out here in the crowd feel like, put your hand up, if you feel like you know more about federal or provincial politics than municipal politics? Hands up. Okay. So it's actually, and then I got one of these. So today, and to end the day, we're going to have a discussion on how municipal politics affects people's daily lives. We've talked about this all day, that it's sort of the level of granularity at which we actually can build trust, and we offer opportunities to reinforce people's trust in institutions and government, but we consistently see the lowest levels of voter turnout of any level of government. And so our conversation today is really going to frame this sort of central tension and central conversation, which is, why is this level of government closest to people's everyday lives often the one that people engage with the least? And so we have three incredible speakers who are going to introduce themselves, and really to ground the end of our day with, you know, the longer term moves at the federal and the provincial level do take time, and trust does take time. We talked about that today. But I think it's so important today to end talking about municipalities, because this is where we build the stamina for long-term change. And it's at the municipal level that we can really build people's, you know, their hundreds of experiences where they're like, I kind of feel listened to. That builds their sort of capacity to wait for the bigger moves that the provincial and federal governments can typically make. So I'm going to give each of our great speakers 3 or 4 minutes to introduce yourself and share a little bit about how you come to this conversation. Starting with Jack.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Jack Lucas. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Calgary here in town, and I'm also a co-director of the Canadian Municipal Barometer, which is a research partnership that focuses on democracy and representation in Canadian municipalities. And one of the things we discussed in preparing for this conversation was some kind of misconceptions, common misconceptions about municipal democracy and municipal politics. So I was thinking about that a little, and I wanted to share two to sort of get the conversation started. One is, I think, a common misconception about municipal democracy is that municipal democracy is boring. It's unchanging, it's dusty, it's basically a snooze. But the truth is, when you actually look at the historical development of municipal democracy across Canada, you see that the municipal level has been the site of extraordinary experimentation with democratic institutions and forms of political engagement that we don't see at the provincial or federal levels. And I could give you many examples of this, but since we're here in Calgary, I'll give you a Calgary-specific example. This city, the city of Calgary, was just the second jurisdiction anywhere in North America to adopt proportional representation. And in fact, the city of Calgary had the second longest lasting proportional representation system anywhere in North America from 1917 to 1974. This is a sort of forgotten piece of Canadian political history, but it's something that many municipalities across Canada have experimented with, and it's just one example of how there's a legacy of institutional experimentation with democratic institutions and institutional reform that I think is something that municipalities could draw on today. The other common misconception about municipal politics is that it's not really politics. You know, politics is about left versus right, liberal versus conservative, serious political cleavages. And is it really true that maybe there's no left-wing or right-wing way to pave a road or fill a pothole? And I think that, too, is a misconception. I recently wrote a book called Ideology in Canadian Municipal Politics, available at a bookseller near you, and argue that...
Let's be honest, this crowd is going to put that book on hold.
Oh, yeah. You're going to quintuple my sales if 7 of you buy it. Municipal politics today involves all of the major cleavages, all of the questions about political polarization, political cleavages, and so forth that we see at other levels of government. And I think that when we think about participation and institutional reform, it's important to think about those questions through the lens of a politics that really is politics, and not something else, something technical or something where we can bracket off the politics. So hopefully that's a good framing to get us started.
Melissa, can I ask you to chime in?
Perfect. So I'm Melissa Fougere. I'm the CEO for Rural Development Network here, situated in Alberta. We do primary work in Alberta, but also across the country in rural communities. And so I think some of the things that Jack just brought up are really important points. We work in those social community kind of aspects, not in that political science area, but really when you look at it, the relationships, the trust, the building of community, the infrastructure of the community, all of those pieces I think are really key to getting that municipal politics out. Like Zahra just said, people know about provincial, they know about federal, but what do they really know about the municipal piece? And in rural communities, it's really not about that right wing, left wing, who can fix the potholes, but it's about trusting who your leaders are and also having your voice heard, right? And so when you think about having your voice heard and you're consulted and you vote and you work with people and they're your neighbors and then you see no results, people disengage. And so in our area of work, we do work with municipalities and we work with local organizations really around the complexities, the engagement, the actual implementation and taking action so that people can see the results. The more people that see the results, the more people that are going to come out and engage in it.
Thanks, Melissa. And Sarah.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Zahra Yaffe. I am leading a new initiative at the Toronto Public Library called the Centre for Democracy. It's a space and a suite of programs that will bring people together to learn skills and build knowledge and have opportunities to contribute to democracy with the idea that democracy is something that we have to practice every day. And that we need to engage in that practice to be able to participate. And so the point that I'll start with here is that when we talk about voting, we are talking about something that happens so infrequently that people are out of practice. And I think one of the maybe most important things that we need to develop is a way to engage people all the time so that they see how democracy is a part of their daily lives, so that they understand how the policies that are implemented, how the people they vote for actually affect how they go about their lives, how it impacts themselves, their children, the future generations. And maybe the other thing I'll say here is that I think even though the pieces at municipal level probably do affect us most tangibly, they tend to be the least sexy. And so they don't get talked about, at dinner tables as much as some of the pieces that are at provincial and federal levels.
I mean, who said raccoon pickup is not sexy? But anyways, thank you all for situating us so beautifully. And maybe I'll just direct my first question to Jack, but anyone is welcome to chime into the conversation. So Jack, you're talking about institutional reform, and Calgary and Edmonton just recently saw a major shift with the introduction of municipal political parties, and you've done extensive research on the effects of that change. And so based on what you've observed, how did partisanship shape voter engagement, understanding, or trust in local politics? And what broader lessons can we learn for municipal reform across Canada?
Well, political parties exist in most political systems around the world because they serve important functions for those political systems. They provide information to voters about the performance of government, good and bad. Sure, sometimes that information is spin, but sometimes there's real content to the information that parties provide to voters. They recruit candidates, and so they build a team of candidates and build connections across that team in preparation to govern or in preparation to serve as the opposition. They also mobilize voters. And so this is true not only in the on-the-ground work that parties do during elections, but they mobilize voters because voters feel a sense of attachment, at least some do, to a political party, and they get out to vote because they want to see their team win. What we saw in Calgary and Edmonton with the introduction of municipal political parties was that some of the promise of political parties maybe We did see glimmers of that with the recruitment of candidates, for example, maybe with the provision of information to some degree, but we didn't see any evidence of any mobilization effects. In fact, turnout was down quite a bit in Calgary and Edmonton, despite high-profile competitive mayoral races in both cities in this cycle versus the last one. And one of the lessons from this experience, although we could talk a lot more about the political party experience in these cities, but one important lesson is that political parties typically emerge organically from within a political system. They emerge out of some kind of demand or desire inside the system itself to coordinate a slate of candidates and run. These parties were imposed on the cities of Calgary and Edmonton by provincial statutory and regulatory reform. They didn't have that organic kind of setting, and one consequence of that is that a certain proportion of voters were angry about the institutional reform itself, and we have pretty good evidence that I've done with some of the people here in the audience, actually, some work we've been working on, that voters punished partisan candidates for affiliating with parties in the cities of Calgary and Edmonton. That's partly because they don't like the idea of municipal party politics, and it's partly because they were angry at the provincial government that imposed those parties and sort of took it out on the local instantiation of that reform. So there are some lessons there for reform of other sorts across the province and across Canada.
You know, I just saw a bunch of nodding heads over here in the audience, and you know, where my mind immediately went, right, was, okay, so it's not converting to voter turnout, but, you know, we did some research in Ontario a few years ago on mapping the experiences of diverse candidates trying to run for office or thinking about it, those who ran, those who ran successfully and unsuccessfully, and the sort of TLDR of it all is like, it's not a great job. We're not going to run, like, we're not going to expose our families to risk. It's not competitive pay to what we can get in the market, and there's other avenues for social change. And so, you know, my initial notion when I, you know, was hearing about, and I grew up in Vancouver, so, you know, more used to that sort of municipal party system. But the idea that these parties could drive recruitment of candidates is actually kind of an exciting thing at a time where we're seeing a decline in the kinds of candidates we want to see engage in municipal politics actually show up.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most important sources of the incumbent advantage in municipal politics is called scare-off. People don't run because they find out the incumbent is seeking re-election. They're not fools. They know that incumbent re-election rates are 85, 90% in many nonpartisan Canadian cities, and they say, oh, I'll sit this one out. I'll wait until it's an open race. One of the things that political parties can do is encourage people to run, even in challenging races against incumbents. And once you have good candidates challenging incumbents, you never know what will happen. You can have 2011 for the NDP in Quebec. You know, these things happen, unexpected events happen. And if there's a candidate there for voters to choose, then sometimes they make that choice and challengers win, even unexpectedly. So that recruitment is a really important part of why municipal politics looks different from other levels in the absence of parties, and it's one of the roles that parties could play and do play in some parts of Canada where they do exist, like Vancouver or Montreal and so on.
Okay, Melissa, we're going to move to you, and I'm going to try to behave because we have a prepared question, but your opening remarks gave me more questions. So I'll start with the one that we know, which is, from a rural perspective, are the barriers to civic participation different in smaller or rural communities? What does engagement look like outside of major urban centers? And where are the biggest gaps? Here's my hot pursuit to you, which is, you know, you talked about how in these in sort of more rural jurisdictions, when people are let down, they disengage. My mind is going to the conversation I got to have with Ian. And I was like, well, in rural communities, are you cross-pollinating more regularly? And what are the difficult conversations like when people are let down? So the first question is about the barriers to civic participation and what are some of the gaps. But then I am quite curious about, like, what do those difficult conversations look like when you are in smaller communities and you have to face your constituents differently than in larger jurisdictions?
let me see if I can put it all in one. I think there's a lot of similarities between urban and rural, as far as engagement, building of trust, all the things that were talked about here today, and we're seeing the challenges everywhere, right? I think the biggest thing in rural communities is that it is relational and not transactional. And so going back to the community infrastructure, right? And having that conversation that it's a daily occurrence. It's not an every 4-year occurrence. And so when your mayor is also your plumber, but is also a volunteer, but is also a parent that coaches soccer, you see each other every single day. And so in some of the smaller areas, and it really defines like how you define rural, because some people will say, you know, it's under 500 people, it's under 10,000. You know, we define it as, you know, being distant from all of the larger infrastructure, all of the larger resources. And so in those communities, you have to approach it in different ways, right? You may not have a local library, you may not have a community center, you may not have a senior center. So how do you have those conversations where they're not on the sidewalk, or, you know, they could be in the grocery store lineup? And so really looking at it differently. When you're looking at the difficult conversations, again, I think I go back to, it's a daily thing. It's not about a campaign. It's not about bringing up the topics. It's about the evidence-based solutions, the, you know, the activities that you're doing, and that there's actual results from it. You can't just talk about it. You need to do it. People will become more engaged. They'll want to be engaged. They'll have difficult conversations with you. You just have to make it a daily effort instead of once in a while. And I think because rural communities, everybody knows everybody, it is built on that relational piece of it.
Yeah, you know, we did work with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities for a number of years, and I vividly remember one of our prep meetings with the then board chair or vice chair, and she was the part-time volunteer mayor of a rural community. And I thought she was distracted in the meeting. I was like, oh, are we not, you know, being clear? She's like, oh no, I'm just writing my thank you cards for later. That, like, because she, you know, she didn't have a staff, she didn't have an extensive team, and so she was just sitting there writing Christmas cards or thank you cards as she was having this conversation about how to meet all the mayors across the country. And it's just, she was wearing so many hats all at once. And so really appreciating that, and I think there's something to be learned there. So we're gonna come back to that. I want to go to Sarah. You know, we love libraries. Institutions like libraries are increasingly and rightfully being seen as civic infrastructure. And what role can these mostly trusted, I think, public institutions play in making local democracy more visible, understandable, and participatory?
So many roles. Let me tell you about a few. I will quote Ian Williams, who said, "Libraries are conversational meeting places that can reinvigorate our democracies." And I love it. I love the idea of conversational meeting place where people can come together across so many different differences, and that people will naturally, libraries are places where people naturally come together with different ideologies, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic status, and where there are very, very few, maybe no barriers to entry. And that doesn't exist in many other, especially indoor places in our society. And the other piece that's so kind of fundamental here is the idea of intellectual freedom. That is a premise of at least the Toronto Public Library, certainly in public libraries across the country as well. But the idea that people should be able to come and access information that is, you know, potentially controversial, potentially even distasteful to some, but that people should have the right to find the information they're looking for, and then have the conversations that address the differences that we all have. And we've been talking about that all day, and I think there are so many opportunities in spaces that are accessible and that are welcoming and that are grounded in that as the foundational nature of what they are, to bring people in. and to support also with high quality information, which is another really key piece of the puzzle around in democracy certainly, but also around having conversations around important issues. So there's so many things that we can do, and we're going to keep doing more, and I'll maybe tell you about more of them too.
Okay. I mean, one of my favorite statistics about the Toronto Public Library is that our main library, the reference library, which some of you might have visited on your travels to Toronto or living in Toronto, 80% of people who use the library don't have a library card. Right, because it is, we talked about the Agora earlier, but it is in many ways the Agora. And, governments, I remember in the early 2010s, like every government wanted one window service for everything. But the library does that. People come in and say, I need employment, I need language skills, I need community, I need, upskilling, and they come to the library. So people are already coming there, and librarians are the one window. So for all of you, from all of the perspectives, and specifically from sort of the area of your work and how you come to sort of municipal civic engagement, who are the groups that, and the specific groups or communities that the municipal democracy consistently fails to reach effectively or engage effectively, and why do you think that is? Anyone can start.
Go ahead.
I'll start. I think for us, what we see a lot of times is some of the demographics that you would expect. It would be the youth, the seniors, the newcomers. We also see Indigenous communities. We see students. It's really about making it more accessible and more present. Because I think what we miss sometimes is rural communities will communicate differently with their audiences. They don't have the big network news stations in their backyard. They don't have the big political platform and convention centers for events. So having people come out to the smaller centers, and so I think really we see a lot of that happening. But when we're working with communities and we're making sure to do that conversation across the community, across demographics, how do you reach people differently, and just continue the conversation, because there are small pockets everywhere. One of the biggest ones that we see, because we work in a lot of the homelessness area, is the precariously housed or insecure housing, or the more vulnerable people who may not know what's going on or understand what's going on, because the language is not plain language. So.
Maybe I'll just add to that to say, to the conversation earlier about the raccoon, communities who don't see their priorities, taken up by their government, are the communities that don't feel that they have, that their voice matters. And often those are also communities that are stretched thin and may not, have the opportunity to actually get to a voting station, and to take time away from all of the responsibilities of real life. And I think when we say, it's your duty to vote, that doesn't appeal to a lot of people. I think we have to really do a different marketing pitch here.
What's the rebrand?
Well, I think I think partly it's it's about a constant practice of democracy. So it feels like something that is part of what we do, and that it's like if we said to people, to high jumpers in the Olympics, you're going to do this every 4 years, but you cannot practice in between. That would be insane. But that's basically what we ask of voters. It doesn't make a lot of sense, at least to me, and I think. I think we have to think about it as an opportunity. Voting is an opportunity, but then we have to make good on that, because we have to then demonstrate that when we vote, things happen as a result.
I'll just add about folks who are more or less likely to participate. It's hard to do research on this in Canada for reasons that we could talk more about, but the research that's come out of similar municipalities in the United States and in Scandinavia shows really consistently that there's two groups of people who disproportionately participate in municipal elections and municipal politics, and that's homeowners and older folks. And one thing
more tenured folks, we'll call them.
That's right, yes. And one thing we've seen that very clearly in the research we've done with the Canadian Municipal Barometer is that municipal politicians across Canada are well aware of this. Last year, we ran an experiment where we showed politicians hypothetical constituents in their municipality with randomly varying characteristics, and we asked them, how likely is this person to vote in the next municipal election in your municipality? They have remarkably accurate perceptions of who participates and who doesn't. You might think that's a good thing, in a way it is, but in fact it creates a kind of self-perpetuating feedback loop where people, especially while they're campaigning for office, are contacting and interacting with the folks who they know are most likely to participate, thereby driving those folks to be more engaged, more informed, and more likely to participate even further in the future. So breaking out of that kind of cycle or that feedback loop, I think, is an important element of moving beyond the standard folks who do participate disproportionately, especially at the municipal level.
Can you just nerd out with us for 1 second about why it's harder to get data about municipal elections in Canada versus the US? We talked about this briefly on our call.
Yeah, in other countries, there's something called a voter file. The voter file gives you information about who voted and who didn't vote in specific elections. It doesn't tell you who they voted for, of course, but it's sometimes publicly accessible, sometimes accessible through different kinds of privacy laws, but you can find out who participated and who didn't. And then, particularly now, using some modern machine learning tools, you can use that information to really understand who is turning out to vote, participating in public hearings, that kind of thing, and who isn't, because you can match it to the hard data of the voter file. What we have in Canada, in the absence of that kind of information, is really just surveys. And we know that people over-report their participation in elections of all kind in surveys. And so we do surveys, we see in our data that 70% of people in the survey say they voted in the municipal election. We know that the turnout rate was 30%. That's a problem for understanding who participates and who doesn't. So in other countries that have this underlying voter file data, in Scandinavia and the United States and some other places, it's easier to find out more specific details about who's showing up and who isn't.
I feel like that's we need Ian back in this room to tell us what kind of lie that is, our overrepresentation of our engagement. So we're at the end of the day, so we want to talk about also what's working. We want to talk about where we're seeing promise. And so for each of you, are there initiatives, reforms, engagement strategies that are actually showing promise in increasing meaningful participation? And you can define however meaningful in whatever way you like at the local level, and something, that are bellwethers for you, things you're excited about, things that give you hope.
Well, I can tell you there are a number of things that are happening in municipalities across Canada that are quite exciting. This is part of that democratic experimentation that I was talking about earlier. One thing that you hear a lot from elected representatives at the municipal level is that they hear from the same people over and over again. There's a municipality in BC whose the councillors started to call it the STP, the same 10 people, who show up at public hearings, public engagement, town halls. They say the same things, the same kinds of complaints over and over again. So a big question is, how do you break out of that sort of pattern to have more meaningful forms of public engagement? And there's a lot of ways to do this, and we have some experts in this kind of thing here on the stage. One thing that's happening is taking advantage of new technological tools to recruit people from the community to participate in deliberative and public engagement kinds of exercises. One example of this is called a random town hall. And it's now possible to recruit participants for these kinds of activities, even at quite specific geographic scales, like a small municipality or a ward in a city. So later this year, we're doing a pilot version of a random town hall in the city of Edmonton, where councillors are going to meet with a random draw of their constituents, not the same 10 people, but a representative batch of their constituents to talk about what's coming up in the budget and the important decisions that need to be made. And there's good evidence from other countries that these kinds of experiences are good for elected representatives and kind of rekindle their enthusiasm for meaningful public engagement, and they're also genuinely informative for citizens. So that's just one example of the kinds of things that are happening, and I think there are a lot of opportunities to do more of this sort of thing as the costs fall, and the technology makes it possible to do it at the municipal scale at a reasonable price.
I think from our perspective, it's really refreshing, I'll say, to see the will of the elected officials wanting to do more public engagement, wanting to know the results, wanting to show the implementation pieces where that voice is heard. And so as we work through projects, as we work through communities, we're seeing that. We're seeing people want to be engaged in a town hall, in a focus group, in an engagement session, because they feel that their voice matters. And so I continuously go back to, we need to do this, democracy as a community infrastructure, and it's a daily thing. Like that's a huge piece, especially in rural communities. And so as we move forward, we're starting to see more and more of that. I think how people communicate it is differently. It's not just door knocking or putting postcards in mailboxes. It's, my community uses Facebook. It doesn't use another methodology. I'm going to go to Facebook. So thinking outside of the box and how to engage people, and also acknowledging some of the challenges. Housing is a hot topic this year. It's been a hot topic across the country for the last few years. And I think people are starting to realize that their voice matters. And if they don't, bylaws are going to change, zoning's going to change, housing is going to pop up in places. So they actually want to become engaged. And so we are seeing some of that shift of the daily democracy versus the every 4 year.
I'll speak about a service that TPL offers, which is called Know Your Vote TO, and it's a voter information website. And what we do is we find sort of the 5 key issues that are affecting people at the municipal level, and do a bit of a primer on each of those issues, so people can come and understand, what's at stake there. And then there is a platform to see every candidate that is running for city council and for mayor, and to see how to have them each answer a question about how they would address each of those issues. So everyone is answering the same questions, and the team that we work with to put this website together does a lot of outreach to all of the candidates to really follow through on that, because it's obviously an intensive operation. And then we combine that with a series of programs to bring people in to engage in democracy. There will be participatory art projects. There will be panels of around how to get engaged and what it takes to run for office, and how you can volunteer on a campaign. So a series of pieces of information to help people out. And I also just want to shout out Amanda and New Majority for the work that they do to make engaging voters fun. Particularly, I'm obsessed with Dogs for Democracy, and yeah, exactly.
That's the reaction you want.
Yeah. So this is a piece of the practice of it every day, is that it also has to be more fun. It has to be more engaging. It has to be more interesting, and it can be. We just have to demonstrate that for people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as we transition into the audience Q&A, I might just, pull a few threads together. We're going to go to audience Q&A for about 5 or 7 minutes to start thinking of your questions. But it's amazing that you said that, because as everyone was speaking, I wrote a note down. That's a principle from Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals that some people in this room might know. And he talks about how sustained social movements are rooted in tactics people actually enjoy doing. Like, why do we never talk about fun? Because we're like, it has to be serious and it has to be boring, and it's like, and we wonder why no one shows up. And so I really do think, the ways in which each of you are talking about this is a reframe on this whole notion of meeting people, on the rhetoric of meeting people where they are, because it's a little more nuanced, where it's like, okay, fine, let's go to where people are going, whether it's the library, whether it's the grocery store, whatever it is, but then also going deeper and saying, is it an issue that they really care about? Is it the issue that they actually want feedback on? Is it Facebook, where they want to have the conversation? Is it, getting specific about a mayoral candidate but not wanting to ask someone because they feel a bit embarrassed that they don't know? So I really think you all brought that nuance to life. We have a runner with a mic as usual. Do we have any questions from the audience? Oh, right here. Right up in the front table. And don't forget to introduce yourself.
Of course. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Hello there. My name is Robert, and as a former political staffer with a Toronto City Councillor, I wanted to ask all of you, I guess, what are tips for political staffers working in municipal office, city councillors, the mayor, or if you're in a small town, a reeve, etc., on engaging their constituents in engaging more in municipal politics. Again, on the inside, in a political office, in a political staffer role. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Is the question how to engage more? Yeah. But no offense. However, what I would say is every time I get invited to a town hall or community consultation by my city councillor, it's for the next day at 6 o'clock at night, when I cannot make it. I have to feed my children dinner at that time. So the one thing I would say is find ways to make engagement actually accessible for people, and make the invitation and the welcome really substantive, and make people feel like you actually want to hear from them. I hope that's not too aggressive.
I was in the in the lead up to the municipal election here in Calgary last year. I spent almost a year following candidates around, kind of embedded in campaigns for a research project I was doing. And one time I was walking from door to door with a volunteer, and I was kind of asking questions about voters and his view of how informed voters are, and he was sort of complaining about low levels of attention and engagement among voters. And then he sort of paused and he said, the truth is that most people don't know about many things, but almost everyone cares about something. And I think that view of the constituents is a really important way to think about civic education and public engagement. That the goal is not to provide a kind of across-the-board civics education necessarily at any opportunity, but to keep track in terms of political staff specifically of who are the people in my community who really care about dog parks, and who are the people who really care about bike lanes, and who are the people who care about housing densification. And when the opportunity arises to engage with those folks on the terrain that they're already passionate about, we know who's on the list. And I think that kind of vision of bringing people into policy development, policy discussions, public engagement from the perspective of what they care about to begin with I think can be a helpful reframe, and can sometimes, I think, for folks who are working for councillors in the bigger cities across Canada, can be a nice way to think about what can otherwise be sometimes challenging when you're just sort of the person responsible for fielding the litany of complaints by email every day. Maybe a different way to think about that problem.
And I think the only thing I would add to the two comments is use plain language. People don't understand the importance of municipal politics. They don't understand when they vote what their voice actually stands for and what the municipal politicians are actually raising at the provincial and the federal levels on their behalfs, and what the MGA actually is. And they think, oh, I'm just being consulted on this and this never happened, and it doesn't really matter. I live in a small town, but it does make a difference. And I think the more and more people understand it in a plain language, you get the youth out, you get, there's different people that come out, and accessibility and transportation is a huge issue in rural as well. But that plain language is so key, and it shows you're human. You're not just reading from a script. You can stumble over your words. You can, not say the right things.
Also ask questions in your invites. I'm learning from all my Gen Z friends that a great social media post has a question,
Right?
It's an invitation versus a statement, and I think I'll also just jump in and say, with all the municipalities we worked with over the last, decade, all of them are wed to ways of doing things that aren't actually codified in rules and laws. So I remember working with the chief planner in the city of Toronto, and we were doing this exercise flipping orthodoxies, and one of his team members goes, man, we should start a community meeting by just having everyone talk about why they came instead of a presentation. But what they said was, but I'm not allowed to. And the chief planner goes, what are you talking about? Of course you're allowed to flip the structure of a meeting. That's not a rule, it's not a law, it's not a bylaw. We can change the structure so you ask everyone at the starting, in tables like this, why are you here tonight? What are you interested in talking about? And then do the presentation at the end. So there's little levers, they're tweaks, right? But they're just tests to see if that actually has people engage in a more deeper and meaningful and honest way and actually has more people speak in the space when they show up. Do we have any other? Oh, we have one right here. The anticipation as the mic approaches.
Thanks.
And
Hi.
introduce yourself.
Yeah, Stephanie Chippier. I'm a professor here at UCalgary's Law School. And I do a lot of work about how the disability community can engage at the municipal level. And I've been really interested in the ways that some groups are structurally advantaged in the public hearing process. So I was wondering what you think about this. I learned that, community associations and business groupings in the neighborhood get formal notice of many meetings or if land use is going to be changed. And that's how it works in Calgary. It's probably similar in lots of municipalities. So I'm wondering if you think that for communities that are left out, who would not what Jack mentioned about who's normally at these meetings are the same people who are in charge of community associations, and they're usually opposing disability community desired projects, etc. So I'm just wondering, do we need to take over community associations? Because the businesses of a neighborhood, you're not, as a poorer or more marginalized group, you're not going to suddenly become business owners, but you could. Do we need to take over those areas, or do cities and other municipalities need to stop structurally treating those groups as if they represent that neighborhood? Does that make sense? I just fear for this kind of non-democratic power of the older folks and homeowners who basically run the community associations across Canada.
Who wants to take that question?
Yeah, everyone's like,
should we take over community associations?
I mean, I think that there needs to be a greater focus on accessibility in terms of community engagement in so many different ways. And I think there's also some interesting practices, that can be helpful for lots of different communities, including the disability community, around peer-to-peer engagement that then feeds in directly to those who are making decisions, so that there are lots of different forms of engagement that are happening. But yeah, maybe I'll leave it there.
I'll just say yes, you should take over your community association. Those of you who are from outside Alberta maybe won't be as aware of the important role that the community associations play in our big cities here, but these are critical for pathway into municipal politics, policy engagement, many other running and managing infrastructure, lots of things. So yes to that. Yes, we also need better accessibility and public engagement processes more generally. My colleague Katie Einstein in the States wrote a paper about online public engagement with the brilliant title, Still Muted. And what this paper showed was that online engagement doesn't change really at all the kinds of people who show up on its own. You still see the same patterns of people turning out for online processes as in-person processes. It's about going to the trouble of engaging people to turn up in the first place. And sometimes there are real opportunities for things like online engagement in terms of accessibility, but only if they're mobilized for that purpose. And it's not this sort of standard practice of saying, tomorrow at 7 p.m. there shall be a Zoom meeting, and please come if you'd like to weigh in on whatever.
The only thing I would add to that is I think when we're looking at it, we're always talking to municipalities about who's missing at the table, who's missing in this room. And so I think, it's organizations, it's the community-based organizations, it's the nonprofits, it's to continuously be present also daily and to be advocating for their participants and, getting that voice out there and making sure that the You know, there are so many ways. Like you said, the accessibility is a big conversation, but I think there is a role for nonprofits, for those community-based organizations, for those community housing associations to really be that advocate or include people on the on the boards, because I think that's where it starts.
Well, friends, we are about to transition into a reception. Much needed snacks and drinks and delights. But before we do, you're going to give us an earworm for all of us to talk about and think about. So, you know, it could be one thing you want people to take away from this conversation and remember. Could be a provocation. Could be just something to reflect and think about as we go into the evening. And anyone can start. One takeaway really fast.
I'm not very good at provocation. I'll just say, for those of you who are in the municipal sector, embrace the legacy of democratic experimentation as part of the culture of what it means to do democracy at the municipal level in Canada.
Yeah. I would say relationships build trust, and trust builds participation, and that's where it starts.
Love both of those. I'm going to give a prompt, and this is not so much based on this conversation, but based on the day so far, and particularly around being able to enter into conversations and disagreements. So I'm going to encourage each of you, the next time you're in an environment where you're with people that you're really comfortable with, that you find something that you disagree about, and that you have a conversation. And unpack what that disagreement might be. And so you can practice what it's like to actually talk to people that you disagree with, but in a space that feels really comfortable, and start to develop those skills. I'll do it too.
So with that, friends, a couple of announcements, and then we're going to really give it up for this panel who took the last slot of the day and did such a great job. Thanks to all of you. We'll just say, you know, I think I'm just going to be thinking about this for the next, you know, for the remainder of the week, but really this idea that we need to reorient democracy, you know, in our mental model as a daily practice, like exercising and meditating. And it's not always going to be fun, but it is something that we have to integrate into our daily routines. And what that looks like, the folks in this room have to create the opportunities, have to help shape opportunities and encourage people to help us do that great work. Let's give it up for our great speakers. And the last piece before we break is please stay for the reception, and there is going to be a great debate in an hour. So go get refueled, chat with some people. Introverts, take your time alone, and we will see you in an hour.
Thank you, Zahra.